When the Carson gang decided to mock the quiet stranger in the faded Marshal's coat, they had no idea they were taunting the most dangerous bounty hunter in the Western Territories, a man who had brought in more outlaws dead than alive, a legend who'd once worn a badge with more notches on his gun than most men had bullets to their name. What happened next in Sierra Station would be whispered about in saloons for decades to come. Before we dive deeper into this story of justice and redemption, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy tales of the old frontier, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story will take you on an even wilder ride. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Iron Jake McBride hadn't chosen Sierra Station for any particular reason. It was just another stop along the transcontinental railroad line, a new settlement carved out of the untamed wilderness where the mountains met the plains. His once pristine Marshal's coat, now sun-bleached and trail-worn, bore the subtle bulge of a Winchester mare's leg strapped beneath it, while the distinctive pearl-handled Remington at his hip had notches that told stories he'd rather forget. The townsfolk who noticed him quickly looked away, unsettled by the methodical way his steel-gray eyes scanned every shadow, every doorway, every face that crossed his path. The town itself sprawled out before him like a hastily dealt hand of cards. Mining offices, general stores, and hastily constructed homes clustered around the railroad depot as if seeking protection from its imposing brick walls. The Sierra Grand Hotel dominated one end of the street, its fresh paint and ornate trim a stark contrast to the muddy thoroughfare below. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the false fronts of buildings, where ambitious merchants had built their dreams 2 stories higher than their means. Between the hotel and the depot, the daily drama of frontier life played out with mechanical precision. Railroad workers hauled cargo from newly arrived freight cars, while merchants hawked their wares from wooden sidewalks that creaked under the weight of progress. Ladies with colorful parasols navigated the muddy street with practiced grace, and children played marbles in the dusty spaces between buildings, their laughter a counterpoint to the constant rhythm of hammer strikes from the nearby blacksmith shop. Most riders heading into Sierra Station made straight for the hotel's saloon, eager to wash the trail dust from their throats with the establishment's overpriced whiskey. But McBride guided his horse toward the livery stable with deliberate patience, his eyes never ceasing their methodical assessment of his surroundings. He'd learned long ago that survival depended on understanding a place before engaging with it, a lesson written in the scars hidden beneath his weathered coat. Young Tommy Chen, the livery stable's owner, was curry-combing a nervous stallion when he felt rather than heard someone approach. He turned to find McBride standing there, holding his horse's reins in one hand and offering a silver dollar with the other. No words were exchanged, just a slight nod toward an empty stall. The practiced ease with which the stranger moved told Tommy everything he needed to know. This was a man who'd spent his life reading situations where the wrong move meant death. "Fresh hay and clean water," Tommy said, accepting both the coin and the reins. His careful eyes couldn't help but notice how the stranger's coat shifted, revealing not just the mare's leg, but also a distinctive brass star partially concealed in an inner pocket. The kind of star that marked its bearer as someone who'd once stood between civilization and chaos. "Your horse will be well cared for, sir." The young stablemaster found himself adding the respectful title without quite knowing why. McBride acknowledged Tommy's words with a slight inclination of his head, but his attention had already shifted to the Sierra Grand Hotel. Through its broad windows, he could see members of the Carson gang sprawled across several tables, celebrating their latest train robbery with the town's finest whiskey. The infamous outlaws had been terrorizing the railroad for months, their brutal efficiency suggesting military training gone wrong. Rumor had it they were planning something big for the next gold shipment, something that would make their previous heists look like practice runs. As McBride watched, Billy Snake Eyes Carson grabbed a serving girl's wrist, yanking her close while his men laughed at her obvious discomfort. The Raven brothers, Ezra and Elijah, were running some sort of shell game at a nearby table, their matching black dusters and silver-plated revolvers marking them as the gang's enforcers. The girl's face showed resignation rather than surprise. This wasn't the first time the gang had treated the townsfolk like props in their ongoing performance of power and intimidation. A subtle shift occurred in McBride's steel-gray eyes, a flicker of something that hadn't surfaced since he'd turned in his badge 5 years ago. He'd sworn to stay out of other people's troubles, to focus solely on the bounties that kept him in ammunition and whiskey. But as he stood there, the weight of his hidden Marshal's star seemed to grow heavier, like an old wound aching before a storm. His quiet contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Chen, Tommy's older sister, her arms laden with supplies for their small general store next to the livery. She paused when she saw him, taking in his trail-worn appearance and the way he carried himself, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to unwind. Unlike others who hurried past with averted eyes, she met his gaze directly, her own eyes holding the kind of strength that frontier life either broke or tempered to steel. "You looking for something specific in our town, mister?" she asked, her direct manner suggesting she'd faced down her share of trouble before. The question held layers of meaning. Was he here as a friend, or another problem they'd have to survive? Inside the hotel, Snake Eyes Carson's laughter boomed through the windows, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a woman's muffled cry. McBride's hand didn't move toward his gun, but something in his stance shifted subtly, a change so small most would have missed it. But Sarah Chen didn't miss it, and her next words carried a weight of their own. "Whatever you're here for," she said quietly, "just remember that Sierra Station's seen enough trouble lately. We don't need any more graves in our cemetery." McBride's steel-gray eyes held Sarah Chen's gaze for a moment longer before he spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent years giving orders that meant life or death. "Just passing through, ma'am, though I might need some supplies before I move on." The words were simple, but something in his tone suggested he knew more about Sierra Station's troubles than he was letting on. Sarah gestured toward their store, its weathered sign proclaiming Chen's General Goods and Supplies in fading gold letters. "Well, you'll find what you need there, though." She paused as another burst of raucous laughter erupted from the Sierra Grand Hotel. "I'd suggest waiting until morning. The Carson gang tends to get meaner as the day wears on." "Lost 3 good men last month," Tommy added quietly, still brushing down McBride's horse. "They tried standing up to Snake Eyes and his bunch. Sheriff found them face down in Rattler's Creek." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much death for his young years. A crash from the hotel punctuated Tommy's words, followed by a woman's frightened cry and more cruel laughter. McBride's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. A subtle adjustment that made him seem somehow more present, more solid. The air around him grew still, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Appreciate the warning," he said quietly, though his eyes never left the hotel's swinging doors. "But I've learned it's best to handle some things before they have time to grow worse." His hand unconsciously brushed the hidden Marshal's star in his coat pocket, a gesture that didn't escape Sarah's sharp eyes. She studied him more carefully now, noting how his right hand rested naturally near his hip, how his feet had shifted almost imperceptibly into what she recognized as a gunfighter's stance. Her father had been a lawman before the war, and she'd grown up learning to read the signs that separated genuine peacekeepers from common thugs. "You were more than just a marshal, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low enough that only McBride and Tommy could hear. "The way you carry yourself, the way you watch everything, you're hunting someone." A ghost of a smile touched McBride's weathered features. "Let's just say I'm interested in making sure certain warrants get served." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded paper, showing it briefly to Sarah before tucking it away. She caught a glimpse of Snake Eyes Carson's face sketched in crude lines, with a number below it that made her eyes widen. "That's quite a bounty," she whispered, "but Carson's got 15 men in there, all of them killers. Even if you were the fastest gun in the territories." "Never been about speed," McBride interrupted softly. "Been about knowing when and where, about understanding men like Carson, how they think, how they react." He paused, considering his next words carefully. You said you lost 3 good men last month. Tell me about them." Sarah's face tightened with grief and anger. Marcus Weber, the school teacher, David Cooper, who ran the assay office, and young Jim Chen, our little brother. Tommy's brushstrokes faltered at the mention of their brother's name. They decided to stand up to the gang when they started demanding protection money from every business in town. "And your sheriff?" McBride's question carried a knowing tone. "Conveniently out of town that day." Tommy spat. "Just like he is every time the Carson gang comes around. Word is they've got something big planned for the next gold shipment coming through." McBride nodded slowly, processing this information. 3 days from now, on the morning train. It wasn't a question. Carson's been hitting every third shipment, always when there's a new moon. Makes it easier for his men to approach the train under cover of darkness. Sarah and Tommy exchanged surprised looks. "How did you?" "Because I've been tracking them since Cedar Junction," McBride explained. 6 towns, 12 robberies, 27 dead. They're getting bolder, more careless. The kind of careless that gets people killed. He straightened up, his decision made. "Might need to resupply after all, Miss Chen. Ammunition, primarily. And perhaps some coffee." Just then, the hotel's doors burst open, and 2 of Carson's men stumbled out onto the street, supporting a third between them. They were heading toward Chen's store, their intentions clear in their drunken swagger. Sarah's hand moved toward the shotgun hidden beneath the store's counter, but McBride's quiet voice stopped her. "Best let me handle this," he said, moving with that same fluid grace toward the store's entrance. "Sometimes it's good to let trouble know you're ready for it." The setting sun caught the edge of his hidden Marshal's star as he turned, making it gleam briefly like a promise of things to come. The last light of day painted Sierra Station's main street in shades of gold and shadow as McBride positioned himself in the store's doorway. Sarah watched him, remembering something her father used to say about certain lawmen, that they carried justice not just in their guns, but in their very bearing. As the 3 outlaws approached, weaving drunkenly across the muddy street, she realized she was about to see if the old saying held true. Behind them, the sun sank lower, casting long shadows that seemed to reach like fingers toward the coming confrontation. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, a lonesome wail that spoke of faraway places and the thin line between civilization and chaos. McBride stood motionless, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the approaching men, waiting for them to recognize what sort of man they were walking toward. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the whispered promise of violence. Sarah Chen found herself holding her breath, wondering if she was about to witness the beginning of Sierra Station's salvation or its final descent into bloodshed. The 3 members of Carson's gang stumbled to a halt as they finally registered McBride's presence in the doorway of Chen's store. The tallest of them, a man with a twisted scar running from his left eye to his jaw, squinted through his drunken haze at the stranger who dared to block their path. If you're enjoying this story of justice and redemption, make sure to subscribe, as we've got more thrilling tales coming your way tomorrow. "Well, looky here, boys," the scarred man drawled, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Seems like we got ourselves a real fancy-dressed law dog." His companion snickered, spreading out slightly in a way that suggested they'd done this dance before. McBride didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. His steel-gray eyes took in their positions, their stances, the way their gun belts rode just a little too low on their hips, the mark of men who'd learned to fight from dime novels rather than experience. "Store's closed," he said quietly, his voice carrying no more emotion than a morning breeze. "Store ain't closed till we say it's closed," the second outlaw spat, revealing a mouth full of gold teeth that glinted in the fading light. "Carson's boys get special service in this town. Ain't that right, Miss Chen?" He leered past McBride at Sarah, who stood her ground behind the counter. "The gentleman said we're closed," Sarah replied firmly, though McBride could hear the slight tremor in her voice, not from fear, but from memories of what had happened to her brother. What had happened. The third outlaw, younger than the others but with eyes that held a snake's coldness, took a step forward. Maybe you didn't hear about what happened to the last folks who didn't show proper respect to the Carson gang. Maybe you need a reminder. His words cut off abruptly as McBride moved. Later, witnesses would swear they never saw him draw. One moment his hands were empty, the next his pearl-handled Remington had materialized as if by magic. But it wasn't pointed at anyone. Not yet. It hung at his side, casual as a conversation. "Thing about reminders," McBride said, his soft voice somehow filling the space between them, "is that they work both ways. For instance, I'm reminded of 3 men I brought in last month. Used to ride with Carson, too, before they got careless in Cedar Junction." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "You're lying. Hank and the Jessup boys went south." "Hangings scheduled for next week," McBride continued as if he hadn't spoken. "They were real talkative once they realized the alternative. Told me all about Carson's operation, about how he picks his targets, plans his raids." His steel-gray eyes locked onto the youngest outlaw. "About who he trusts with his secrets." The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances, their drunken bravado giving way to something closer to concern. The scarred man's hand tightened on his gun grip. "You trying to say you're some kind of bounty hunter?" A ghost of a smile touched McBride's lips. "Among other things." "There's 3 of us and 1 of you, mister," Gold Teeth snarled, but there was a quaver in his voice now. "Should have brought more men," McBride replied softly. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for Sarah Chen, watching from behind her counter. The youngest outlaw went for his gun first, probably hoping to make a name for himself. His hand had barely touched the grip when McBride's Remington barked once. The young man's gun belt fell to the ground, its holster strap cleanly shot through. Gold Teeth managed to clear leather, but his shot went wide as McBride's second bullet knocked the weapon from his grasp with surgical precision. The scarred man got off 2 wild shots that shattered the store's front window, before a third report from McBride's Remington sent his gun spinning into the dust. 3 men, 3 shots, and not a drop of blood spilled. The entire exchange had taken less time than it took to draw a deep breath. "Next time I won't aim for the guns," McBride said into the ringing silence that followed. His voice hadn't raised above that same quiet tone, but now it carried an edge that made the 3 disarmed men take a step back. "Take a message to Carson. Tell him Iron Jake sends his regards." The effect of those words was immediate. The color drained from the scarred man's face. "Iron Jake? The Marshal who—" "The same," McBride cut him off. "Now ride." They didn't need to be told twice. The 3 men scrambled for their horses, leaving their guns where they'd fallen in the street. Their panicked departure kicked up clouds of dust that painted the scene in a hazy light, making what had just happened seem almost like a dream. But it had been real enough. Sarah Chen stepped out from behind her counter, her eyes moving from the fallen guns to McBride's already holstered Remington. "I've never seen shooting like that," she said softly. 3 men disarmed without a single casualty. "Killing's easy," McBride replied, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "Living with it's the hard part." He turned to inspect the broken window, reaching into his coat for coins to pay for the damage. Sarah waved away his attempt at payment. "Those men would have done worse if you hadn't been here. But Iron Jake? I've heard stories about a Marshal by that name. They say he brought in the entire Wilson gang single-handed, that he tracked the Compass Killer across 3 territories." "Stories grow taller with each telling," McBride said dismissively. But something in his eyes suggested the tales might have more truth than he was willing to admit. Tommy burst in through the back door, shotgun in hand. "Sarah! I heard shots." He pulled up short at the scene before him, the broken window, the discarded guns in the street, and McBride standing calm as a mountain lake in the midst of it all. "Your friend here just took on 3 of Carson's men," Sarah explained, a note of admiration in her voice. "Disarmed them all before they could blink. And now Carson will come looking for blood," McBride added grimly. "Those men weren't just here to cause trouble. They were testing the town's defenses, seeing who might stand in their way during the robbery. He moved to the broken window, scanning the street with those methodical eyes. Carson's clever. He'll have had watchers in place, ones who've seen everything that just happened. Night settled over Sierra Station like a velvet blanket, bringing with it an uneasy quiet that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. If you're enjoying this tale of justice in the Old West, make sure to hit that subscribe button, as tomorrow brings another thrilling story you won't want to miss. McBride stood in the deepening shadows of Chen's store, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the Sierra Grand Hotel across the street. Through the windows, he could see the ripple of movement as word of the confrontation reached Carson's men. The gang leader himself had appeared at the window briefly, his snake-like eyes scanning the darkening street before disappearing back into the lamplight.
"You know him, don't you?" Sarah asked quietly, joining McBride at the window. "Carson, this isn't just about bounties."
She'd been watching the former Marshal closely, noting how his hand unconsciously touched the star hidden in his coat whenever Carson's name was mentioned. McBride was silent for a long moment, his weathered features lost in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memories he'd rather forget. Billy Carson wasn't always snake eyes. Back during the war, he was Captain William Carson, Union Cavalry. We served together in the same unit. Tommy, who had been sweeping up broken glass, stopped to listen. The young stable master had developed a keen interest in the quiet stranger who'd turned their world upside down in less than an hour. "He was a good soldier once," McBride continued, his eyes distant. "Maybe even a good man. But the war changed something in him. Started small at first, taking contributions from towns we were supposed to be protecting, looking the other way when some of our men got rough with civilians." His jaw tightened. By the time I realized how far he'd fallen, he'd turned half our unit into his personal gang of thieves. "What happened?" Sarah asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew the story wouldn't have a happy ending. "I tried to stop him, gathered evidence, planned to report him to command." McBride's hand moved unconsciously to a scar on his neck, barely visible above his collar. "Night before I could, Carson and his loyal men ambushed me, left me for dead in a ravine outside Atlanta. By the time I recovered, he'd deserted with 20 men and a wagon full of Confederate gold they'd been supposed to guard." The store fell quiet as the implications of this revelation sank in. "So that's why you became a bounty hunter," Tommy said softly. "You've been tracking him all this time." "Tracking them all," McBride corrected. "Every man who turned his back on the oath we took. Everyone who chose greed over honor." His voice hardened slightly. 17 of the original 20 are either dead or in prison now. Carson and these last few are all that's left. Sarah moved closer, her hand briefly touching McBride's arm. "And now he's here, planning something big enough to risk crossing paths with you again." "The gold shipment," McBride nodded. "But it's more than that. Carson's not just after the money anymore. He's trying to build something bigger, a network of controlled territories, where his word is law. Sierra Station's strategic position makes it perfect for his plans. Take control here, and he controls the whole railroad line through the mountains." A commotion from the hotel drew their attention. The Raven brothers had emerged onto the street, their matching black dusters making them look like twin shadows in the gathering darkness. They moved with purposeful strides toward the telegraph office. "Sending for reinforcements," McBride observed quietly. "Carson won't want to face me with just the men he has here. He'll call in every favor, every former soldier who ever rode with him." His eyes narrowed slightly. "By tomorrow night, this town will be crawling with killers." "Then why stay?" Tommy asked. "Why not just leave, come back when the odds are better?" "Because that's what he's counting on," Sarah answered before McBride could speak. "He's hoping the same man who's been hunting him all these years will finally back down." She looked at McBride questioningly. "Isn't that right?" McBride's ghost of a smile returned. Carson never did understand that sometimes standing your ground is more important than surviving. He turned to face the Chen siblings fully. But this isn't just my fight. Those reinforcements are coming whether I stay or go. If I leave, Carson takes Sierra Station, uses it as a base to terrorize the whole territory. If I stay, he let the implications hang in the air. If you stay, we fight, Sarah finished firmly. And maybe we show Carson and his kind that not every town can be bullied into submission. Could be dangerous, McBride warned, though something in his eyes suggested he'd already known what her response would be. Carson's men won't hesitate to burn this whole place to the ground if that's what it takes. Tommy straightened up, the broom in his hands held like a rifle. They already killed our brother, burned down the schoolhouse when Mr. Weber tried to stand up to them. How much worse can it get? Much, McBride said softly, his hand again touching the hidden Marshal's star. But maybe it's time someone showed them that badges and bullets aren't the only sources of strength in this world. He moved to the store's back room, where his saddlebags lay. First thing we need to do is get word to the townspeople. Anyone who wants to leave should go now before Carson's men start watching the roads. Sarah and Tommy exchanged determined looks. They won't leave, Sarah said with quiet certainty. This is our home. Maybe it's time we all stopped running. McBride paused in his preparations, something flickering in his steel-gray eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a strength he hadn't expected to find in this dusty railroad town. Outside, the last light of day painted Sierra Station's buildings in shades of purple and gold, while somewhere in the distance, a coyote's lonely call echoed off the mountains. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon, nature itself seeming to sense the confrontation brewing in this quiet corner of the frontier. Dawn broke over Sierra Station with the sharp crack of hammers against wood as townspeople began boarding up windows and reinforcing doors. If you're enjoying this tale of courage and redemption, make sure to hit subscribe, as tomorrow brings another thrilling story you won't want to miss. McBride stood on the roof of Chen's store, watching riders approach from the south, the first of Carson's reinforcements arriving under cover of early morning shadows. His steel-gray eyes counted 6 men, all wearing cavalry-style gun belts and riding with military precision. More would come throughout the day, drawn by Carson's call and the promise of easy riches. That makes 18 now, Sarah said from behind him, having climbed up to deliver a cup of coffee. She'd traded her usual dress for more practical attire, canvas trousers and a man's work shirt, with a gun belt slung low on her hips. And those are just the ones we can see. McBride accepted the coffee with a slight nod. Carson always was good at getting men to follow him, has a way of making violence sound like destiny, greed like ambition. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. But he makes mistakes. Always has. What kind of mistakes? Tommy called up from below, where he was helping the blacksmith Marcus Wade modify wagon wheels into makeshift barricades. He thinks fear is the same as respect, McBride replied softly. Thinks breaking people is the same as beating them. His free hand touched the hidden Marshal's star, and he never learned that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most weight. Sarah studied the former Marshal's profile in the morning light. You are not what I expected, she admitted. When you first rode in, I thought you were just another bounty hunter looking to make a name for himself. A ghost of a smile touched McBride's weathered features. Names are just words, Miss Chen. Actions are what matter. He set down the empty coffee cup and pointed toward the hotel. Carson's watching us right now, trying to figure out our plan. He knows me well enough to know I'll have one. Indeed, through the hotel's upper windows, they could see Carson himself standing at the glass, his snake-like eyes fixed on the growing activity in the street below. The gang leader's face bore a carefully neutral expression, but the way he gripped his fancy ivory-handled revolver betrayed his unease. Town meeting in an hour, Sarah reminded McBride. Pastor Miller's opened the church for us. Everyone who's staying wants to help, but they need to know they're not just walking into a slaughter. McBride's expression darkened slightly. No guarantees in this life, Miss Chen. especially not when Carson's involved. He paused, considering his next words carefully. But maybe that's what he's never understood. Some things are worth dying for, but more importantly, some things are worth living for. The church bells began to toll, calling the townspeople to what might be the most important meeting of their lives. McBride descended from the roof with that fluid grace that marked his every movement, Sarah following close behind. As they walked toward the church, both noticed how the town had transformed overnight, and the usually bustling Main Street had become a carefully planned defensive position. Marcus Wade's modified wagon wheels were being positioned at key intersections, while the Chinese laundry workers, led by old Mrs. Liu, had strung ropes between buildings, perfect for hanging heavy quilts to block snipers' views. Even the children were helping, running messages between groups of adults and gathering stones to use as ammunition. Inside the church, the pews were packed with determined faces. These weren't just shopkeepers and railroad workers anymore. They were people who had decided to take back their town. Pastor Miller, a tall man with silver hair and a cavalry veteran's bearing, stood at the pulpit beside Sheriff Cooper, who looked decidedly uncomfortable. "About time you showed up, Sheriff," someone called out as McBride and the Chens entered. "Where you been hiding since Carson rode in?" Cooper's face reddened. "Now see here, I was conducting official business in—" "Save it." McBride's quiet voice cut through the growing murmurs. "What matters is what we do now." He moved to the front of the church, his presence somehow filling the space more effectively than any shouted speech could have. "Carson's called in every gunman and former soldier who ever rode with him. By sundown, we'll be outnumbered 3-1. "Then why fight?" Cooper demanded. "Why not just let them take what they want and leave?" "Because they won't leave." Sarah stepped forward, her voice strong with conviction. "This isn't just about the gold shipment. They want Sierra Station itself. Want to turn our home into their private kingdom." McBride nodded. "Miss Chen's right. I've seen it before. Carson takes a town, uses it as a base to control the whole territory. Anyone who stands against him disappears. Any business that won't pay protection money burns." His steel gray eyes swept the congregation. "But it only works if people let it work, if they choose fear over freedom." "What chance do we have against professional killers?" someone asked. "Better than you might think," McBride replied, that ghost of a smile returning. "Carson expects a straight fight, guns against guns. But this is your town. You know every alley, every rooftop, every cellar. Knowledge like that's worth more than a wagon load of fancy revolvers." He began outlining his plan, using the church's blackboard to sketch out positions and assignments. The telegraph operator would send false messages about troop movements. The Chinese laundry workers would create confusion with their hanging quilts. Even the children had a part to play, acting as lookouts and messengers. "And when the shooting starts?" Marcus Wade asked, his mechanical arm gleaming in the church's lamplight. "That's where Carson's other mistake comes in," McBride said softly. "He thinks this is about him and me, a personal vendetta. He'll be so focused on finding me, on proving he can finally beat Iron Jake, that he won't see the real threat until it's too late." "And what's that?" Pastor Miller asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already understood. McBride's hand touched the hidden Marshal's star one final time. A town that's finally decided to stop being afraid. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Sierra Station's main street as Carson's reinforcements continued to arrive. If you're enjoying this story of justice and redemption, make sure to hit subscribe, as tomorrow brings another tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. From his position in the church tower, McBride watched through his brass spyglass as another group of riders approached, former soldiers by their bearing, their horses kicking up dust clouds that turned golden in the fading light. Through the hotel windows, he could see Carson's men preparing for what they thought would be an easy victory, checking weapons and passing bottles of liquid courage. "That's 28 now," Sarah reported, climbing up to join him. She'd spent the last hour helping to position townspeople according to McBride's plan. "Carson's got men in the saloon, the hotel, and that abandoned warehouse behind the station." McBride collapsed the spyglass with a soft click. He's planning to hit us from 3 directions. It's how he took Henderson's Crossing last year. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Problem is, he's fighting the last battle, not this one. Sarah studied the former marshal's face in the warm afternoon light. You knew he'd do this, didn't you? Set it up this way. Carson was always predictable to those who knew where to look, McBride replied softly. He'll want to make a show of it. Prove he can beat Iron Jake at his own game. His steel gray eyes narrowed slightly. And that's exactly what we're counting on. Below them, the town had taken on an eerily deserted appearance. Windows were shuttered, doors barred, the usually busy street empty except for a few strategic barricades. But behind those closed doors and windows, every able-bodied resident of Sierra Station waited, armed with everything from proper rifles to kitchen tools. They're moving, Sarah whispered, pointing toward the hotel. The Raven brothers had emerged, their black dusters making them look like twin crows against the dusty street. They moved with exaggerated casualness toward Chen's store, their silver-plated revolvers hanging low on their hips. Testing our defenses, McBride observed, seeing if we'll show our hand early. He touched Sarah's arm gently. Time to get everyone in position. Remember, no one moves until they hear my signal. Sarah nodded and descended the tower stairs, pausing only briefly at the bottom. Be careful up there, she said softly. Carson will have sharpshooters watching for you. Always does, McBride replied with that ghost of a smile. That's part of the plan, too. As Sarah disappeared to coordinate with the townspeople, McBride returned his attention to the street below. The Raven brothers had reached Chen's store, their boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. Through his spyglass, he could see Carson himself watching from the hotel, a satisfied smile playing across his snake-like features. Come on, Billy, McBride whispered. Show me you haven't changed as much as you think you have. As if on cue, Carson emerged onto the hotel's balcony, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. I know you're watching, Jake. Why don't you come down and face me like a man? Or have you gotten too soft playing shepherd to these sheep? McBride made no response, but his hand unconsciously touched the hidden Marshal star in his coat. He'd worn that star with pride once, believing in what it represented. Carson had been the one to teach him that symbols were meaningless without the conviction to back them up. The Raven brothers, emboldened by the lack of response, began testing the store's defenses, rattling doors and peering through gaps in the shuttered windows. Behind them, more of Carson's men emerged from various positions, moving to surround what they thought were the town's key defensive points. Last chance, Jake, Carson called out again. Surrender now, and maybe we don't burn this town to the ground. Keep playing games and, well... He gestured to one of his men, who immediately threw a lit torch onto the roof of the Chinese laundry. But instead of catching fire, the roof erupted in a spray of water. Old Mrs. Liu and her workers had spent hours soaking every wooden surface they could reach, turning the buildings themselves into part of their defense. The unexpected failure seemed to enrage Carson. Burn it all, he roared. Smoke them out. More torches flew, but each met the same fate. Carson's men, frustrated by their failure, began firing at windows and doors, their shots echoing off the empty buildings. But no return fire came. Sierra Station seemed to absorb their violence like a patient parent weathering a child's tantrum. McBride watched it all through his spyglass, noting positions, counting ammunition spent, waiting for the precise moment when Carson's frustration would overcome his tactical judgment. It didn't take long. Enough of this. Carson's voice cracked with fury. Jake, you've got 1 minute to show yourself, or I start shooting hostages, starting with that pretty Chen girl. And there it was, the mistake McBride had been waiting for. Carson's threat revealed that he didn't know Sarah's true position, didn't understand that the town's apparent vulnerability was actually its greatest strength. McBride raised his arm, a signal mirror flashing once in the afternoon sun. Across Sierra Station, the real battle was about to begin. The flash of McBride's signal mirror had barely faded when Sierra Station erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. If you're enjoying this tale of frontier justice, Make sure to subscribe, as tomorrow's story will take you on an even more thrilling adventure. Behind the hanging quilts strung between buildings, Marcus Wade's mechanical arm squealed as he released a series of pulleys. Suddenly, empty barrels began rolling down the street's slight incline, their thundering approach sending Carson's men scrambling for cover. In their confusion, none of them noticed the real threat: Tommy Chen and a group of stable hands emerging from the livery's hidden cellar doors, armed with coils of rope. "What in blazes?" Carson snarled from the hotel balcony, firing uselessly at the barrels. "Stop hiding behind tricks, Jake. Face me like a man." "Funny thing about facing people," McBride's quiet voice carried from somewhere in the chaos, though no one could spot him. "Sometimes the real battle isn't where you think it is." The Raven brothers, still near Chen's store, turned toward the voice exactly as planned. From behind the shop's false shutters, Sarah and Mrs. Liu's workers opened fire with shotguns loaded with rock salt. The twins howled in pain, dropping their silver-plated revolvers as the stinging spray found its mark. Carson's men began firing wildly at windows and rooftops, but the hanging quilts and rolling barrels had destroyed their depth perception. Shots that should have found targets passed harmlessly through empty spaces, while return fire from the townspeople, carefully aimed and precisely timed, began picking off outlaws with wounds designed to disable rather than kill. "Find him!" Carson roared, his composure cracking as his perfect plan dissolved into confusion. "Find Iron Jake." "Got bigger problems than that, Billy." McBride's voice came again, this time from a different direction. "Like why your men can't get to their horses." Carson spun toward the livery stable, where Tommy and his group had used their ropes to quietly corral all the outlaws' mounts. The horses were being led away through the back alleys, leaving Carson's reinforcements stranded. "Or why your sharpshooters can't seem to get a clean shot," McBride continued as more quilts dropped from upper windows, creating a maze of shifting shadows and false targets. On the hotel's roof, Carson's best marksmen found themselves caught in the sudden spray of Pastor Miller's volunteer bucket brigade. The water didn't hurt them, but it made the roofing tiles treacherously slick, forcing them to abandon their positions. Through it all, McBride seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, his voice drifting from different locations while his actual position remained a mystery. It was a technique he'd learned during the war, using confusion and misdirection to multiply his apparent force. "Enough games." Carson's face had turned an ugly shade of red. He grabbed one of his remaining men. "Start burning buildings. Smoke this whole cursed town out." But when the outlaws tried to approach the buildings with torches, they found the ground beneath their feet suddenly unstable. Old Mrs. Liu's laundry workers had spent the morning soaping the boardwalks and streets in strategic locations, turning them into treacherous slides when wet. "You still don't understand, do you, Billy?" McBride's voice held a note of something almost like pity. "This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about something you never learned: the strength of people protecting their home." As if to emphasize his point, Marcus Wade's mechanical arm whirred to life again, releasing another wave of obstacles into the street. This time, the barrels contained the contents of Sierra Station's chicken coops. Carson's men found themselves caught between angry fowl and slippery footing, their attempts at coordinated action dissolving into individual struggles just to stay upright. "Carson!" The Raven brothers had managed to recover their guns, but their fearsome reputation was somewhat diminished by their reddened faces and cautious movements. "This ain't working. We need to regroup." "No!" Carson's voice cracked with fury. "No one leaves. Not until we find—" His words cut off as a single shot rang out, different from the others. Carson's fancy, ivory-handled revolver went spinning from his grip, a precise bullet having struck its hammer mechanism. The gun hadn't just been shot from his hand, it had been disabled completely. "That's one." McBride's voice came from directly behind him. Carson spun to find his former friend standing there on the balcony, having somehow crossed the chaos below unseen. The former Marshal's pearl-handled Remington gleamed dully in the late afternoon light, unwavering as it pointed at Carson's chest. "Been a long time, Billy," McBride said softly. "We need to talk about old promises and broken oaths. In the street below, the battle had shifted decisively. With their horses gone, their positions compromised, and their leader suddenly vulnerable, Carson's men began to realize they'd walked into a trap. But it wasn't the kind of trap they were used to. There was no killing ground, no crossfire to cut them down. Instead, they found themselves caught in something far more devastating: the unified resistance of an entire town that had decided to stop being afraid. The late afternoon sun painted Sierra Station's chaos in shades of amber and gold as McBride and Carson faced each other on the hotel balcony. If you're enjoying this tale of redemption and justice, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story will take you on an even more incredible journey. "You've gotten soft, Jake," Carson sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as he glanced at his disabled revolver lying useless at his feet. "All these tricks and games. The Iron Jake I knew would have just shot his way in here." "The Iron Jake you knew died in that ravine outside Atlanta," McBride replied quietly, his pearl-handled Remington unwavering. "Just like the Captain Carson I served with died when he chose greed over honor." Below them, the street had grown eerily quiet. Carson's men, disarmed and disorganized, were being corralled by townspeople who'd emerged from their hiding places. The Raven brothers stood sullenly under Sarah Chen's watchful shotgun, while Tommy and Marcus Wade secured the other outlaws with their own gun belts. "Honor?" Carson's laugh held a bitter edge. "Is that what you call this? Hiding behind women and shopkeepers? Using tricks instead of facing me man to man?" He straightened up, his snake-like eyes gleaming. "Or maybe you're just afraid. Afraid to admit that I was right all along, that badges and laws are just pretty lies we tell ourselves." McBride's steel-gray eyes never wavered. "You really don't understand what happened here today, do you, Billy? This wasn't about tricks or tactics. It wasn't even about you and me." His voice carried across the sudden stillness. "This was about showing these people they didn't need a legendary lawman to save them. They just needed to stop being afraid." "Afraid?" Carson's hand moved slightly, and McBride noticed the derringer hidden in his sleeve, a backup weapon he'd always favored during the war. "I'll show you what fear looks like, old friend." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those watching below. Carson went for the hidden derringer with the speed that had earned him his reputation. But McBride had known it was coming, had counted on it even. His first shot knocked the small gun from Carson's hand before it could clear his sleeve. The second bullet struck Carson's gun belt buckle, sending it clattering to the balcony floor. "That's 3 guns I've taken from you today," McBride said softly. "Want to try for 4? Carson's face twisted with rage. "You always were a show-off with that fancy shooting. But you still can't do what needs to be done. Still can't pull the trigger when it matters." His hand moved to his boot where a final weapon lay hidden. "That's why I'll always win in the—" The next shot came not from McBride, but from below. Sarah Chen's shotgun roared, the rock salt blast catching Carson in the leg just as he went for the boot gun. He stumbled, off balance, and found himself staring down the barrels of dozens of weapons held by townspeople who'd had enough of living in fear. "You're right about one thing, Billy," McBride said, his quiet voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "I'm not the same man who chased you across 3 territories. I learned something in all those years of hunting you." He holstered his Remington slowly, deliberately. "I learned that true justice isn't about who can shoot fastest or kill quickest. It's about standing together against men like you who think fear is the same as strength." Carson, his legs stinging from the rock salt, looked around wildly. His men were disarmed and captured. The town he'd thought would be an easy conquest had turned into a trap, and his old friend turned nemesis hadn't just beaten him, he'd done it without killing a single person. "So what now, Jake?" Carson's voice held a desperate edge. "Going to drag me back to face a hanging judge? Add another notch to your legend?" "No," McBride replied simply. "These people are going to deliver you to justice. I'm just here to make sure you face it." He turned slightly, addressing the gathered townspeople. "Sheriff Cooper, I believe you've got some cells that need filling." Cooper, who had emerged from hiding now that the danger was past, stepped forward with an uncomfortable expression. "Actually, Marshal, I think maybe it's time I turned in this badge. Ain't been wearing it proper for a long time now." "Then we'll need a new sheriff," Pastor Miller called out. "Someone who understands that true strength comes from standing together." His eyes met McBride's meaningfully. A ghost of a smile touched McBride's weathered features. "Been running a long time," he said softly. "Maybe it is time to stop." His hand touched the hidden Marshal's star in his coat, not a reminder of past failures now, but a promise of future possibilities. "No!" Carson made one final, desperate lunge, pulling a small knife from his boot. But before he could take 2 steps, he found himself facing not just McBride's drawn Remington, but the combined weapons of an entire town. The knife clattered to the balcony floor. "That's 4, McBride said quietly. "And that's enough, Billy. It's over." As the sun set over Sierra Station, painting the scene in deepening shades of gold and shadow, the townspeople began securing their prisoners for transport. Carson and his men would face justice not just for their crimes here, but for every town they'd terrorized across the territories. Sarah Chen approached McBride as he descended from the balcony, her shotgun resting casually in the crook of her arm. "So, Marshal," she said with a slight smile, "thinking of staying around for a while?" McBride looked out over the town, at Tommy helping Marcus Wade repair the damage, at Mrs. Liu and her workers already taking down the hanging quilts, at Pastor Miller organizing care for the wounded outlaws. His hand touched the Marshal's star that had weighed so heavily for so long. "Might be," he replied softly. "Seems like Sierra Station could use someone who understands that the quietest voice sometimes carries the most weight." 3 months after Carson's defeat, Sierra Station had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. If you've enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption, make sure you're subscribed, as tomorrow brings another unforgettable story from the old frontier. The physical signs of the battle had long since been repaired. Marcus Wade's mechanical arm had seen to that, its precise movements helping to rebuild and strengthen the town's structures. But the deeper changes were visible in the way people carried themselves, in the proud set of their shoulders and the fearless look in their eyes. The Sierra Grand Hotel, once Carson's fortress, had been converted into a proper establishment under new management. The saloon no longer echoed with the cruel laughter of outlaws, but instead rang with the genuine warmth of community gatherings. Even the bullet holes in the balcony had been preserved, polished smooth as a reminder of the day Sierra Station found its courage. McBride stood on the boardwalk outside his new office, the Marshal's star now displayed openly on his chest, catching the morning light. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the street where children played freely, no longer ducking into doorways at the sound of approaching horses. The pearl-handled Remington still rode at his hip, but these days it spent more time gathering dust than maintaining order. "Never thought I'd see you standing still long enough to grow roots," Sarah Chen said, approaching with a cup of coffee, a morning ritual they'd developed over the past months. She'd kept her practical attire from the battle, having found it suited her new role as deputy just fine. "Neither did I," McBride admitted softly, accepting the coffee. "Spent so many years chasing Carson and his kind, almost forgot what it felt like to have somewhere worth staying. The town had changed him as much as he'd changed it. The perpetual tension in his shoulders had eased, and though his eyes remained watchful, they held a warmth that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Got word from the territorial marshal yesterday," Sarah reported, leaning against the railing beside him. "Carson and the Raven brothers were convicted. They'll be spending a long time thinking about their choices in Yuma prison." McBride nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And the others?" "Most took the deal you suggested. Reduced sentences in exchange for helping track down the rest of Carson's old network." Sarah smiled slightly. "Seems your reputation as Iron Jake still carries weight, even if you prefer quieter methods these days." Tommy Chen rode past leading a string of horses. The young stablemaster had expanded his business, teaching others the gentle horse handling techniques he'd learned from McBride. He waved as he passed, his free hand resting comfortably on the deputy's badge he now wore with pride. "Town council meeting tonight," Sarah reminded McBride. "They're voting on expanding the railroad station, maybe adding a proper courthouse." She studied his profile in the morning light. "Planning to stay around long enough to see it built?" A ghost of a smile touched McBride's weathered features. "Got nowhere else I need to be." His hand brushed the Marshal star that no longer felt like a burden. "Besides, someone needs to make sure this place doesn't forget what it learned that day." "About standing together?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "About finding strength in unexpected places," McBride corrected gently. "About how the quietest voice sometimes carries the most weight." He gestured toward the street, where Mrs. Liu was teaching a group of children both Chinese and English letters, while Marcus Wade demonstrated the finer points of metalworking to a mixed group of eager apprentices. The morning stage rolled in, bringing new settlers drawn by Sierra Station's growing reputation as a place where law and justice meant more than just who had the fastest gun. Among them was a reporter from back east, notepad in hand, eager to write about the town that had transformed itself from a haven for outlaws into a symbol of frontier progress. "They'll want to talk to you," Sarah said, nodding toward the reporter. "About Carson, about that day." "Not much to tell," McBride replied with characteristic modesty. "Town just decided to stop being afraid." "Because you showed us how," Sarah countered. "Showed us that true courage isn't about fancy shooting or facing down bad men. It's about standing your ground, about believing in something bigger than yourself." McBride was quiet for a moment, watching the town go about its morning business. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Carson never understood that. Thought fear and power were the same thing, but real strength," he gestured toward the townspeople going about their lives, "real strength is in knowing when to stand together, when to trust in something more than just your own gun hand." The morning sun climbed higher, painting Sierra Station in shades of promise and possibility. Somewhere down the street, a piano played in the hotel, its cheerful notes mixing with the sound of children's laughter and the rhythm of hammers as new buildings rose to accommodate the growing community. "You know what I think?" Sarah said, taking McBride's empty coffee cup. "I think Iron Jake finally found something worth protecting instead of just someone worth hunting." McBride's ghost of a smile returned as he watched Tommy teaching a young boy how to properly hold a horse's reins, while Mrs. Liu's students practiced their letters in both English and Chinese in the dust of the street. "Maybe we all did," he said softly. "Maybe we all did." 6 months after Carson's defeat, travelers passing through Sierra Station often found themselves pausing to marvel at the transformation. If you've enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, make sure to subscribe, as tomorrow brings another unforgettable tale from the frontier. The town had not just survived, it had flourished. The new courthouse rose proudly at the north end of Main Street, its fresh-painted columns gleaming in the sunlight. Where Carson's men had once terrorized shopkeepers, new businesses opened weekly, drawn by tales of a community that had learned to stand together against any threat. McBride's office, a modest building between Chen's expanded general store and Marcus Wade's flourishing forge, had become something of a legend itself. Aspiring lawmen from across the territory came seeking wisdom from the man they still called Iron Jake, though few recognized him in the quiet Marshal who spent more time mediating disputes than drawing his pearl-handled Remington. "Got another batch of letters," Sarah announced, entering the office with a stack of mail. Now officially appointed as full deputy, she'd traded her old shotgun for a proper revolver, though she still claimed the rock salt had served her better. "Seems every town with trouble wants to know our secret." McBride looked up from his desk where he was teaching Tommy's youngest deputy recruit the finer points of tracking. His steel-gray eyes held a warmth that would have seemed impossible during his hunting days. "What do you tell them?" "Same thing you always say," Sarah smiled, setting down the mail. "That the quietest voice often carries the most weight." Through the window they could see Sierra Station's newest additions, a proper schoolhouse where Mrs. Liu taught both languages to all children, a community hall built by Marcus Wade's apprentices, and the expanded railway station that had made the town a crucial stop on the transcontinental line. "Had word from Yuma this morning," Tommy added, entering with fresh coffee for everyone, another tradition that had taken root. "Carson's been asking to speak with you. Says he's got information about other gangs operating in the territory." A ghost of a smile touched McBride's weathered features. "Let him wait. Some lessons take time to learn." He stood, adjusting the Marshal's star that now sat as naturally as breathing on his chest. "Speaking of lessons..." They stepped out onto the boardwalk just as the evening stage arrived, bringing more settlers, more opportunities, more chances to build something worth protecting. Among the arrivals was a young man with a familiar look in his eyes, the same haunted determination McBride had carried during his hunting days. "Another bounty hunter," Sarah observed quietly. "Third one this month." "Looking to make a name for himself, no doubt," Tommy added. McBride studied the young man for a moment, recognizing something of his former self in the way the stranger carried his gun like it was his only friend in the world. "Maybe what he's really looking for is a reason to stop running." Sarah's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Like someone else we know?" The sunset painted Sierra Station in shades of promise, the last light catching the Marshal's star like a beacon of hope. From the schoolhouse came the sound of children reciting lessons in 2 languages, while Marcus Wade's forge rang with the sound of progress being shaped by hands both mechanical and human. "You know what Carson never understood?" McBride said softly, watching as the young bounty hunter took in the peaceful scene with obvious confusion. "It's not about being the fastest gun or the scariest reputation. It's about building something that outlasts us, something worth protecting. Something worth stopping for," Sarah added, squeezing his hand. McBride nodded, his quiet authority drawing the young bounty hunter's attention. Their eyes met across the street, steel-gray wisdom meeting desperate youth, and something passed between them, a recognition of a shared path, though at different points along the journey. "Welcome to Sierra Station," McBride called out, his voice carrying that same gentle strength that had faced down Carson's entire gang. "Might be we've got something here you've been looking for." The young man's hand, which had been hovering near his gun, slowly relaxed. Around him, the town continued its evening routine. Shopkeepers closing up, families heading to dinner, children playing their last games before sunset. Not a single person flinched at the sight of his weapon or hurried past with lowered eyes. "You know what I think?" Tommy said, watching the scene unfold. "I think Sierra Station's got a way of helping people find what they really need, even if it's not what they thought they were looking for." McBride's ghost of a smile returned as he watched the young bounty hunter begin to understand what he was seeing. Not just a peaceful town, but a place where strength came from standing together, where justice meant more than just being quick on the draw. "After all," Sarah added with a knowing smile, "it worked on the legendary Iron Jake." The last light of day painted the town in shades of gold, turning the Marshal star on McBride's chest into a promise kept, a journey ended, a home found. Somewhere down the street, a piano played in the hotel, its notes carrying on the evening breeze like memories of battles won not with bullets, but with the quiet strength of people standing together. "That it did," McBride agreed softly, his voice carrying no further than his family, both born and chosen, around him. "That it did."